All right, we'll be getting started. If you need to turn your chairs around so that you can see your screen, the screen, that might be a good idea. And please feel free to keep eating while we go through this. We'll have some time for discussion, so as long as you chew and swallow before speaking, we'll all forgive each other for continuing our lunch. So this Lunch and Learn is called Beyond the Binary, Gender Expansiveness in Judaism. And what we will do today, we will explore the story of creation through gender expansive commentary. We looked a little bit at the creation story already, and then we'll expand on it by looking at what the rabbis had to write about it. So we'll look at their commentary. And then we will learn about the androgynos. And the androgynos is one of the 6 genders in rabbinic Jewish text. So this first commentary that we'll be studying together is from Breshit Rabbah. And Breshit is the Hebrew word for the first book of Torah, for Genesis. And Breshit Rabbah is a midrash, and a midrash is a rabbinic commentary. It's a rabbinic commentary on Genesis, written in the 4th through 6th centuries CE. And so just a little bit of an explanation of midrash. Midrash, the word, comes from the Hebrew root drash, which means to interpret. And so a midrash, they're generally stories or commentaries, but really it's an interpretation. It's a way to help us understand the Torah by offering more information. And so for those of you who have done a little bit more Torah study, Torah can be a little bit like poetry sometimes, where there's a lot in between the lines. There's a lot that's not said. It's not always the most expansive explanations. And so Midrash is really helpful to help us expand on the Torah, to give us more information and help us understand it a little bit better. So this is from Breshit Rabbah. Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Elazar said, "At the time when the Holy One, blessed be God, created the first Adam, created the first human, God created it as an androgynos. As it is written, male and female, God created them." And so we'll get to androgynos in just a second, but to unpack this a little bit, they are picking up on the issues of pronouns that we mentioned earlier, that only one human had been created at this time, and yet they see in the Torah, one, it says male and female, and it also uses this plural pronoun them. And so the rabbis were understanding that this must have been very intentional on the Torah's part, that the Torah doesn't have any mistakes according to the rabbis, and so they see it as the them is referring to the male and female, but that is encapsulated in one single being. So they're saying this one single being was androgynos, and that encompasses male and female gender. So an androgynos, as I said, was one of the 6 rabbinic categories of gender. We'll go into all 6 of them in a little bit. But the androgynos is defined as a person who has both male and female characteristics. So this is very much like the English word androgynous. It comes from the Greek, andro meaning male, gyno meaning female, and those being combined. And so for people who know a little bit of Hebrew might recognize that this isn't actually a native Hebrew word. The rabbis borrowed this word from the Greek. So they were definitely interspersed with the Greeks at this time. They were learning Greek mythology. They borrowed some Greek words, but they're doing this in a way to really make it in Jewish tradition and in Jewish text. So they're borrowing the Greek word, but they're not borrowing the Greek mythology. So if anyone knows anything about androgynous in Greek mythology, I'm not learned in that, and so I can't exactly answer any questions about how it fits in with Greek mythology. And the rabbis certainly were aware of it, but they're trying to distance it from the Greek mythology to make it so that it's really not borrowing another person's religion, just borrowing their language. So this is Breshit Rabbah continued. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman said, at the time when the Holy One, blessed be God, created the first Adam, God created it with a double face, one on each side, and then split the Adam along the middle and created two backs, one back here and one back there. So Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman is expanding on what Rabbi Yirmiyah had said previously. Rabbi Yirmiyah is the one who declared that the first human was androgynous, and now they're trying to think, well, what would that person actually look like? If there's one human that is male and female, how can we visualize this human being? How can we picture them in our heads? And so Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman is expanding on this and saying that actually this first being didn't have any backside. They really had two front sides. They had two faces, two front sides. And when I studied this text in rabbinical school, one of my professors he made a great point about this. He said that if you think about human beings, we really all look the same from the back. It's really quite impossible to tell someone's gender from their backside. And that it's our front sides that are differentiated from each other. And so the front sides have the different gendered physiology. And so this would make sense to have male and female on each side. But then it also makes sense that when you split the human down the middle, you create an identical side for each of them when the split happens. Does that make sense? So they've said this, but they're going to get a little bit of pushback from their students. For those of you who know about rabbinic commentary, you probably know that no explanation goes without an argument. So his students challenged him and they said, well, doesn't it say that God took a tsela from Adam, thinking that tsela means rib? Doesn't it mean that, there was a rib and that was how Eve was created? And Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman was ready for them. And he said, don't read tsela as rib. That is a mistranslation. Tsela means one of its sides, just as we see in Exodus 26:20. And for the tsela of the tabernacle, which they translate as side of the tabernacle. And so if we think about it, where our ribs are, we call that our side. And so it even exists in English that we might have a word for side, and it can have many different meanings. It can mean a rib. We have a backside as well. That's also a side of ours. Or there's a side of a building or a side of the tabernacle. And so they're saying, yes, tsela can mean rib, but to use it to mean rib here is really a mistranslation. Read it as side. And then that way we can read it as backside. So when God took the tsela, what God did was created a backside for this two-faced human. Okay, so before we get to the next part, any questions on this commentary or reactions?
So maybe it was meant to be ambiguous, rib or side. I mean, maybe they didn't want to define it, or maybe in the Torah.
Yeah, maybe it was meant to be ambiguous. I mean, we see that a lot in the Torah.
Unless there are two separate words for each of them that they could have used. I don't know.
Well, so one thing about Hebrew, especially in biblical Hebrew, it has a very limited vocabulary. And one of the benefits of English and also of other languages that the Torah was translated in is other languages had a lot more words available. And so we see this even with Aramaic, that with the translation of the Torah into Aramaic, that was a type of interpretation because Aramaic had a bigger vocabulary, and so it helped people understand what was actually being talked about in the Torah. And so, yes, there's a question of, what does side mean in this instance?
So that made me think about the reasons for which God created two human beings to start later on, because we know from the Midrashim that the human being or the earthling was lonely. And I keep thinking, if you are this being, so first of all, you're one being, but you might have, different sides or different aspects to you. But if you don't see the other side's face, then you never really fully come in touch with it. So it's almost as if, you need to be able to comprehend the other being or the other aspect of reality to feel like you're in a relationship with it.
And that makes me think, too, there's the Hebrew phrase, panim al panim, face to face, and it really translates to mean intimate. Panim al panim, when you look someone in the face, that you have an intimate relationship with them. And so this first human having two faces, but the faces were on opposite sides of each other, it was impossible for the human to see the other side, panim al panim, face to face. And so that can contribute to the loneliness as well. And then the separation, then they can look each other in the face and have that intimacy.
Was there anything about them being identical, and so you cut them in half and it was identical, or were there different aspects? Did it go into more detail that, feminine aspects of personality or compassion in one and, attributes in the other half?
So the question was, do they explain how the sides were different? They do say that one side was male and one side was female, but that's as far as the Midrash goes. Right. They don't really go into the attributes, but Kabbalah expands on it and they go into the attributes. And I didn't put this here in this presentation, but something that I find really interesting is Kabbalah, it actually talks a lot about gender. It really goes into gender not just as a physiological aspect of our identities, but really as a personality, character traits. And so Kabbalah goes into how since the first human was both male and female and was split, that actually Kabbalah says when God split the first human, it wasn't a perfect 50-50 split. That in fact that was impossible. Just think about our bodies, how, our veins are intertwined and everything is connected. And so when God split this first human, there was a little bit of femininity in Adam, there was a little bit of masculinity in Eve, and therefore every single person retains sort of that multi-gendered aspect of the first human. No one is 100% one thing or 100% another thing. And even if you're mostly one way or another way, you have a little bit of that intermixing left over from the first human. And they have a lot of really interesting ideas about gender in Kabbalah. They say, in fact, that because of this multi-gendered being, and also because of the understanding that the soul is housed within the body, and the soul also was therefore split into male and female, that it is possible to have a male soul within a woman's body or a female soul in a man's body. And what I find really interesting is they actually say that a lot of our matriarchs and patriarchs had this condition where they had a mismatched soul and body. For example, they say Jacob, it's said that Jacob was born circumcised. He didn't need a circumcision. And Kabbalah says the reason why he was born circumcised is because, in fact, he had a female soul. And so it reflected in parts of his body. And then they say because he had a female soul in a male body, that this made him multigendered in the way that the first human was multigendered, and that brought him closer to God's image. That made him even holier, more sacred, and that is why our entire people, Yisrael, is named after Jacob. So I find that really interesting to really turn it on its head to say it's not only is it not a mistake, that potentially it's a blessing and that it brings us closer to God and can potentially make us even holier.
So one more other interesting comment in this vein, which kind of predates Kabbalah, is the commentary on the book of Proverbs or on Mishlei. And as you know, the most famous part of the book of Proverbs, which is a bit dry and nothing happens there. It's a collection of ancient wisdoms. Is the Eshet Hayil, which is basically the last chapter, the woman of valor, which is the last chapter of the book of Proverbs, and traditionally is sung by a male partner to his female partner. So in any case, there is a verse there which I will paraphrase as, many were the daughters of Jerusalem, but you have surpassed them all. And then interestingly, the question is, so the rabbis ask, so who were the daughters of Jerusalem who this woman, has surpassed? And then they give a very confusing answer, because they say, well, the daughters of Jerusalem, which were exemplary models of femininity, were, drumroll, Joseph and Boaz. So Joseph, as in the one who brought people to Egypt, and Boaz, the one who showed kindness to Ruth. We have just read the story on Shavuot. So they had this idea that they were men, but they kind of showed a lot of feminine quality. So because if you think about it, Joseph and his multicolor dream coat, and Joseph, who never achieves anything by military prowess or by strength, but only by smarts, and Boaz, who's basically the epitome of kindness and caring nature. They felt that they were men who represented a very feminine model of being in the world. As in I think in the traditional rabbinic interpretation, and that is taken into Kabbalah, there is a model. There is two qualities. There is a quality of gevura, and gever is male, and gevura is being a hero. So it's kind of showing active strength. And there is a model of rachamim, and rachamim comes from the womb, which is mercy. So it's so if a person is motivated more by what we would call the drive to achieve or the drive to care, and they would say that that these were gendered qualities. But as we know, they're not gendered. Human beings have both in different proportions. So that would mean that we just like we today believe we're a mixture of different of our desire to achieve and desire to care for others. They would have said that while it's a theoretical model, as Rabbi Ariel said, that everybody has it to some degree, a mixture of these qualities.
And just to say that this doesn't only apply to the men having female characteristics, but it happens the other way too. Just to give a brief story about Rebecca. Rebecca is very active in her role. So she's the one who comes out and says, "Let me water your camel." She runs to greet the messenger, and these were considered at that time to be masculine characteristics, especially in the ancient Near East. Women were not to be by themselves without a chaperone, and also it was seen that any well or any food would be owned by the men of the tribe, and so it technically was not her water to give, and yet she's taking upon that role. And so they say that Rebecca too has sort of this masculine energy, and that is part of the reason why she was picked to be Isaac's wife. So the comment was that in a lot of Renaissance paintings, the men and the women look more similar to each other than maybe we would depict them today. And that specifically in a painting of Adam and Eve, they were the same height, very tall. Yeah, and broad, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we see. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. So this next section, merism, it's a phrase that refers to a literary device, and it means in which two contrasting parts refer to a whole. And the reason why I bring this in here is because actually we see this happening all of the time in Torah. Merism is really commonly used in Torah writing, and specifically we see it in the creation story. And so, for example, if we think back to the creation story, it said that God creates day and God creates night. But as Rabbi Mati read last night, the Twilight People prayer, we know that day and night are not the only times of day. We know that twilight exists, and it's this in between of day and night. And so we're not meant to read day and night as a dichotomous binary where only day exists and day is only day, and only night exists and only night is night, but really to think about it as encompassing a whole. So day on one extreme, night on another extreme, but encapsulating everything in between. And so to expand this to gender, we can say this about male and female as well. That just as God created day and night, but we know that twilight exists, God created male and female, but we know that there is a spectrum in between. Okay, we'll take a little detour into the 6 genders of Rabbinic Judaism. So I'll first go through the 6 genders, and then we'll expand a little bit more on androgynos. So these little definitions were adapted from Rabbi Elliot Kukla from transtorah.org. And so he really was instrumental in bringing this back to sort of mainstream Judaism. It has always existed in Judaism, but it has been ignored really for centuries and forgotten, and he really was a key figure in bringing it back into our consciousness and awareness. So we have already seen Zachar and Nekeva. Zachar is usually translated as male in English, and what's interesting is even though Hebrew does not have a very large vocabulary, there is a distinction between male and man. So Zachar is male, it really can encompass anyone of any age, as opposed to Ish, which is man, and specifically someone who is of an adult age. Same with Nekeva. Nekeva means female, and distinct from Isha, which means woman. And so we do see a little bit of that separation kind of in English and in today's modern society, what we would consider the difference between gender and sex. We can't let that confuse us, though, because in ancient times, they did not have Judith Butler, and they did not have a distinction between gender and sex. So even though they have different words for male and man, that's really just about age. They want to make sure that anything that is for male persons applies to children as well, as opposed to other societies that maybe only had children follow male obligations at the coming of age. So yes, gender and sex are not distinguished in ancient times.
So would it mean that Ish and Isha are basically male and female, but who are able to procreate? So
In Yiddish, you said? For female or? Yes, yeah. I unfortunately do not speak Yiddish, but I know Yiddish has a lot of the same words as Hebrew, so that. Yes, and so that really is talking is just encompassing all ages. So Isha means woman, but it can also mean wife. So that's really specifically a woman of marrying age. And same with Ish. And so Ish and Isha would not be talking about children. And this is really to encompass people of all ages. And then we have androgynos. As I said, this came from the Greek. And it means a person who has both masculine and feminine characteristics. And to give a little bit of a sense of how commonly used this word was, it has 149 references in Mishnah and Talmud, and 350 references in classical Midrash and Jewish law codes. So it came up a lot. Specifically, you see it came up almost more than twice as many times in law codes, and that's because they were really concerned with if men have certain laws that they need to follow and women have certain laws that they need to follow, what does someone do who is both male and female? How do they follow the laws? So we see it's really commonly used in halachic literature in the law codes because they needed to come with unique situations of how the androgynos could follow Jewish law. The next gender is tumtum. For anyone who speaks modern Hebrew, this sounds like a really offensive term. It's not quite so offensive in ancient Hebrew. And a tumtum is a person whose gender characteristics are indeterminate or obscured. And so we don't really have a concept of this in today's society. In ancient times, they considered it of a tumtum person was actually either a man or a woman, but they couldn't tell what they were. We don't really know exactly how that situation would arise, but for example, it was said that Abraham and Sarah were both tumtum before God intervened, and that was why they were unable to have children naturally. And then God corrected their tumtum condition and revealed that Abraham was male and Sarah was female, and then they were able to conceive and have children. So we do see tumtum appears in our ancient texts as well, 181 references in Mishnah and Talmud, 335 in classical Midrash and Jewish law codes. And then our last ones, Elonit is a person who is assigned female at birth who develops masculine characteristics at puberty. So when this person is born, they said this person is a girl, she's female, but then she doesn't go through the normal expected female puberty. In fact, at puberty, there seems to be a change that happens, and this person who is presumably thought to be female starts to develop male characteristics and really, in fact, in a way becomes male. And 80 references in Mishnah and Talmud, 40 in Midrash and codes. And then we see the counterpoint to that in Saris. And Saris is a person who is assigned male at birth who develops feminine characteristics at puberty. But there are two different types of Saris. There's a Saris Chama. Chama is an ancient word for son. So it means like a natural born Saris, someone who is Saris without intervention. And then there's Saris Adam. Again, Adam means human, so it's like almost like a human-made Saris. And Saris Adam is also sometimes translated as eunuch. And this was really a social class in ancient times. And so the eunuchs were generally people who were castrated as a way to give them they were a social class in relation to a king or a ruler, and the king didn't want any men to have access to his wives or his concubines, and so anyone in the king's court needed to be turned into a eunuch so that the king could then trust this person to be around his wives or his concubines. And so the saris that are mentioned in the story of Esther, you might have heard of the eunuchs in the story of Esther. These would be saris Adam, not saris Chama. And there are 156 references in Mishnah and Talmud, 379 in classical Midrash and Jewish law codes. So now we're going to learn a little bit more about the androgynos, and the androgynos is really the one who gets spoken about the most out of all of these 6 genders. The androgynos kind of is in its own category, and you'll see the androgynos pop up a lot. And our text with the most information about the androgynos shows up in Mishnah Bikurim 4. So the Mishnah is a precursor to the Talmud. The Talmud is kind of a commentary on the Mishnah. And this specific chapter, the Talmud didn't pick up on. So we don't see this having a counterpart in the Talmud. So we have to go back to the original Mishnah text to really see it. And Bikurim means first fruits. It's about offering the sacrifice of the first fruits to the temple. Some of you might have heard that, with agricultural laws, they gave sacrifices not just of animals, but also of agriculture. And so in the beginning of Bikurim, they're talking about who is obligated in the offering of the first fruits. And then there comes the question of, is the androgynos obligated in the offering of the first fruits? And since androgynos was mentioned, now they need to say, well, who is the androgynos? What is that person? And so if you were to be writing the Mishnah, and you want an explanation of who the androgynos is, what do you think you would include in that explanation? The creation story. Yeah, so maybe you would include the creation story and say this was the start of humanity. I think it would include some sort of diagnostic information. How do you tell if a person is androgynous? What characteristics do they need to have to be able to be labeled an androgynous? I mean, maybe this is just modern society, the DSM, whatever, needing a set of characteristics in order to diagnose someone. But we actually see something very different what the rabbis do. Instead of having any sort of diagnostic criteria or any stories about how the androgynos originated, what we see is it begins like this. An androgynos has in them ways similar to men, ways similar to women, ways similar to both men and women, and ways that are not similar to either men or women. This is the introductory paragraph, and then each paragraph that follows, so the next paragraph explains all of the ways that the androgynos is similar to men. The third paragraph is all of the ways that the androgynos is similar to women. The fourth paragraph is all of the ways the androgynos is similar to both men and women. And the fifth paragraph is ways that the androgynos is not similar to either men nor women. And so remember I said a little bit earlier how the ancient rabbis did not have any distinction between gender and sex like we do today. So to them, gender encompassed both physicality, our biology and our physical bodies, and also sociology, the social, cultural aspects of gender roles and characteristics, personality characteristics. And so in looking at the ways that the androgynos was similar to men, women, both men and women, and neither men nor women, in fact, over 80% of the examples given are social aspects of gender. So what the androgynous would wear, who the androgynous would hang out with, whether the androgynous can marry women or men, things like this. In fact, they have a couple of things that relate to biology, but very, very few. And the things that relate to biology go back to obligations and laws. For example, if an androgynous has a beard, is not meant to cut the corners of their beard similar to men. But it doesn't say an androgynous needs to have a beard. It just says if they do, they follow the laws of men. Or in terms of any type of impurity, the androgynous can be made impure in ways similar to women and similar to men. So they really have double the nida requirements. I know that doesn't really apply to us as Reform Jews, but it was very important to the rabbis. And so instead of getting any sort of diagnostic criteria, instead we get sort of an explanation of the laws that they follow. So it's social and biological, except there's a very heavy emphasis on the social. The biological is really much less important. And in fact, we have absolutely no mention of genitals, which I think in today's society, a lot of people say the androgynous is probably very similar to what we consider to be intersex today, except in intersex conditions, someone who is physiologically both male and female, there's a heavy, heavy emphasis on genitals. Really, that is how an intersex person is diagnosed at birth. And yet the rabbis have no mention of that whatsoever. They're much more concerned with the social aspects of gender. And so in the very last paragraph of Mishnah Bikurim 4, after talking all about how the androgynous is similar to men, similar to women, similar to both men and women, and not similar to either men nor women, Rabbi Yossi says, an androgynous is a being unique unto themselves, and the sages cannot determine if they are a man or a woman. And I included the Hebrew here too, androgynous bria bifnei atzma hu. Because as we've said, Hebrew is a very gendered language. It actually was not possible to have gender-neutral terms in ancient Hebrew, and yet Rabbi Yossi does that very thing. Atzma means unto herself, and hu means him. So really, if I were to translate this literally into English, it would say, he is a being unique unto herself. And it was the rabbi's way of saying, even though this whole time we've been talking about the androgynous with male pronouns, it's just because in Hebrew the male pronoun was considered to be the gender-neutral pronoun. Do not think that that means the androgynous is a man. And I will prove it with this statement by saying he is unique unto herself. Yes, that's also another thing. He in Hebrew means she.
I would actually, building on Hebrew and how multifaceted Hebrew is, bifnei, it comes from in the face of, like that. So I would translate it: androgynous is a he that faces no woman who is like her.
So really we're emphasizing the complexity here and the inability of the androgynous to be categorized into a gender binary. Absolutely. So the statement is that there's some ambiguity and crossover of gender in ancient times. And I think that was why I started with saying, too, how I was so confused that this isn't a diagnostic information. It doesn't tell us, well, how do you know if your child is androgynous? What do you look for? And even with some of the genders that we saw before, a lot of them, there's a change that happens around puberty. So there's even the idea of maybe you had it in your head that this person was a certain way, but you can't become stuck in your ideas because people can change. And then you need to adapt to the change.
But what I'm confused with is from, well, from the time of the birth of Isaac, or really the birth of Ishmael, the decision was made to circumcise. So that forced to create sexual identity from a genitalia standpoint. Men were circumcised, women were not circumcised. Other than other traditions along the way. But it was defined that a male, only a boy would have circumcision in 7 days. So there was, obviously, when the child was born, no matter what its social or other characteristics were, it was defined sexually, was it not?
So that comes up in the law codes with androgynous. So there's a big question of, does the androgynous get circumcised, and at what day does the androgynous get circumcised? I didn't include this in here, but I've done a lot of my own research, so I can say that the rabbi said the androgynous does get circumcised, but for those of you who know a little bit about the laws of circumcision, it is said that for boys, circumcision precedes everything else. So even if the circumcision is supposed to happen on Shabbat, where you normally don't do any sort of work, you still circumcise on Shabbat. It is the one obligation that can precede the laws of not working on Shabbat. But they say, since the androgynous is not a male, even though you circumcise the androgynous, you do not circumcise them on Shabbat.
But how does one define at birth?
That's the question.
How does one define at birth other than sexuality?
Mm-hmm.
Whether the child born is, let's take all 6 categories.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it'd be pretty easy to determine at birth physiologically whether the child is a Zakar male or Nekeva female. I don't see how you can define a child at birth as any of the other 4 categories at birth. These are all defined well after birth. So probably what has created so much dichotomy in the real world over all the millennia is everyone got fixated on the first 2 and said, at birth, you're either a male or a female.
Right.
And then after a while, rather than understanding that's may how be at the beginning, all these other identifications can be identified, but they occur after birth. And of course, we then have a whole lot of other issues in Torah that sort of contradict itself
Right.
in this context. But again, I'm curious if a person is androgynous that is physically born male, they would be circumcised. And if
Yes.
they're physically born female, even though they're androgynous, there would not be any circumcision.
Right. So there is a lot of ambiguity there of what does the child look like when they're born, and we are not told that they need certain characteristics. And so there are some now who say,
Those characteristics sexually by penis and vagina.
well, we do today.
Yeah, but even in those days, they said, at least Torah said, your males will be circumcised on the 7th day.
Right.
I'm assuming, because the word circumcision came out, that sexual identification existed way, way, way back when.
Right.
And androgynous, while it may have existed, was a byproduct of what was going on in society, socially, that said this narrow identification of male-female isn't going to work.
So one other thing is, so androgynous don't have to get circumcised on the 7th day. So it's, to me,
Eighth.
on the 8th day.
Yeah.
So whether it falls on Shabbat or not. So no, it cannot be
They cannot be circumcised on Shabbat.
So that makes it sound like it's less important.
It is less important, yes, because they're not considered to be Zachar. And so they say that since the obligation only falls on Zachar, that they are not under that obligation. But they say because there is a penis to be circumcised, they should still be circumcised. But then there's a question of, so we have this sort of understanding that if there's talk about an androgynos getting circumcised as a baby, then we can assume that the androgynous baby has a penis. We don't know if that means the androgynous baby has a penis and a vulva. We don't know. It doesn't tell us, but we do know that there are intersex conditions where that's possible. But we also know that the majority of intersex conditions do not have multiple genitalia, and much more likely it is that the baby will look to the human eye to be female, but then if we were to test chromosomes or to do an internal search, we would see undescended testes or chromosomally XY chromosomes, and that's the most common type of intersex condition. And so we don't know exactly, is this referring to what the ancient people would also call sort of a hermaphrodite, someone with both genitalia, or is it much broader and much more encompassing of that? And we have to kind of assume that it's an umbrella term so that it can encompass the physiology of someone who has physical characteristics of men and women, but also the social cultural aspects of it. But then, as you were saying, if it's the social cultural aspects of it, it could be that we go under the assumption that this person is male for the majority of their life, until they maybe reach puberty, start to develop more social characteristics, and then we reevaluate and redetermine what they might be. Right, exactly. Mm-hmm.
So I want to comment on the topic of androgynous circumcision, and how it's confusing, because how do you know it is an androgynous, and when these characteristics that would go against a binary categorization appear later. Well, we need to remember that the rabbis were interested in creating a legal system that would account for all the possibilities, even if all the logical possibilities, even if such a logical if they haven't encountered one. So the way I read it, and I'm not expert like Rabbi Ariel, is like this: we know that there is a category of people who might not neatly fit into these roles, and we want to create a comprehensive set of laws for these people from the cradle to the grave, and that includes circumcision. So the way I read it is, androgynous, when it comes to offering, fruit on Shavuot, functions in this way. When it comes to, shaving a beard, functions in this way. It can marry this and this person, can be sit on this or this side of the mechitza in the old world. And they were like, and by the way, if this person already hypothetically is, shows the characteristics of our androgynous, when they emerge from their mother's womb, then this and this applies to them. Mitch is right that that it is more likely that that people would have categorized or miscategorized this person early on, but but the rabbis want to make absolutely sure if there is a case when you cannot categorize at all early on, then it fits in the category of androgynous. So kind of like accounting for if the characteristics that would make the person androgynous would be visible from the get-go. So I think I think what I find amazing about the Jewish law is that it is both a reflection of the reality as they knew it, but also anticipatory, knowing that that are logically possible categories that they haven't experienced, but doesn't mean that that they're not impossible.
And I think just to build on what Rabbi Monty said a little bit more, to say that they really truly want to honor God in all ways possible. And part of that is to honor God's creation in the human being that they believe that God created. And so if we look a little bit in, sort of secular approaches to intersex babies, for most of history, intersex children were surgically altered at birth to be turned into female children. They seemed to think that it's easier to take away than to add on. And they felt like, someone had to be male or female, so they would surgically alter the babies. And the rabbis were really saying, you can't change what God created. God created this person as a mixed being, and instead of changing it and trying to determine, oh, can we make it into a man? Can we make it into a woman? Instead, they say, well, how can we alter our laws to give space for this person to be both? And so there are a lot of complications that come up with that, especially understanding that not every one of the babies is going to look the same or really be similar to each other. And in some ways, it's going to be contradictory to the laws that end up. And so, for example, of one of the contradictory laws, we know that there is this ancient prohibition on homosexuality in ancient Judaism. And if someone is both male and female, if they were to marry either a man or a woman, it would technically be a homosexual union, because no matter who they end up with, it's same sex in some way. And so because of that, they say, well, women with women is less offensive to the rabbis than men with men. So they say, ideally, an androgynous should marry a woman, because that way it's less likely to be a male-male union. But then they also say, however, if an androgynous is to marry a man, that marriage is considered to be binding and valid, and they would still need a get in order to get a divorce. And so we do see some contradictions here. They say, well, they really shouldn't, but if they do, it's okay. And so I think that goes back to Genesis as well, to the very first creation story where God said, it's not good for humans to be alone. And they're understanding that, well, in a perfect world, it would be a lot easier than this. But it's not easy, and we have to make sure that no one gets ostracized from society, that they can't, engage in customs and rituals, or that they can't have a holy union that is, respected by the rest of society.
Question. From birth until identification, you identify puberty. It could be earlier in puberty, but let's say identification through socialization, whatever. It appears to me your number 1 and 2, the Zachor and Tikvah, really gets more identified in the 5 and 6, which then where they're born with a sexual identification based on physiology, except for those children that make people that are born with a multiple identification, which is very rare. But they're born with one identification, and the change occurs through socialization, the social world, when they become aglonit or saris, where they realize that what they look like at birth, they're not as they're growing older. Their body, their chemistry, whatever the reasons are, the socialization, they are not identifying with the physical way they were characterized when they were born. So I see the connection between 1 and 2 and 5 and 6.
Mm-hmm.
The 3 and 4, the obscured or both, it's hard for me to understand what's obscured versus both, particularly at birth.
Mm-hmm.
I can understand the obscured or both as a child is moving along because there's so much conflict, but I think that ultimately ends up being either one or the other identifying binary.
Right.
Then that's true androgynous because you're identifying binary, both male and female. You're going to be both male and female for that individual. That's sort of the way my old-fashioned, old style, reconcile what was taught to me the opposite way.
So that's part of the problem with the text that we're given, is that they really only tell us what laws each of these beings should follow. So we have absolutely no characteristics of how to identify these people. Everything that we have of characteristics, we're reading backwards. We're sort of detectives of saying, well, if they can't shave the corners of their beards, that must mean that they have beards. But we weren't told that they had beards. right? So everything we're doing sort of this deductive reasoning with. It would have been a lot easier had the rabbi said, here's how you determine if someone is androgynous. And if we see for the androgynous too, it's the one, well, we don't see it in the first two, but we don't see any mention of birth. It doesn't say a person who is born with male and female characteristics. So we don't know. We know that there are some babies who are identified as androgynous because they do talk about the 8-day circumcision for androgynous. But we don't know if they needed to be identified as children or if they could have been identified later in life. We just simply do not know.
The custom and tradition set that up for the millennium,
Mm-hmm.
does it not?
What do you mean?
I mean, from the beginning, whether when it was I studied Torah or 2,000 years ago, the Torah started coming out.
Right.
It created sexual identification. And so sexual
Right.
identification became the norm until recognition occurred through the rabbinical writings, which were centuries later, that, wait a second, there's a whole group in between, either at birth or by identification through socialization.
Right.
Don't fit the quote, mold. The mold is written in Torah as a mold, and then later time said, wait a second, there's way more than the mold here.
Right.
We need to understand it, but even as we understand it, attempt to understand it, we still, if we're going to go have identification on gender, I'm trying to figure out how my child could be identified as anything other than in their physical body.
Mm-hmm.
That physically, now that
Right.
is history and background and creation. I'm trying to figure out how do we go beyond the 1 or 2 step on day 1 through day 10 of a child's life.
We don't know.
Yeah,
We don't know.
I don't think we, unless we do genetic testing, I don't think we can.
Right.
Other than what we see.
But so what's interesting about this is because, here, let me see if I can pull it up just for people to glance at. I do have the entirety of Mishnah Bikurim, and let's just take a quick look at it. So we would think with our sort of modern conception of gender being, as you said, very physiological, and also that ancient gender, we consider that to be very physiological. Of a child is born, you determine if they need to be circumcised or not, you've determined their gender. And so I have this fun little color-coded document of the entirety of Mishnah Bikurim 4. Let's see if I can make it bigger. And so this is where we have to really go back in time to conceptualize gender in ancient times and to understand that it really was not as physiological as we would like it to be. That's really a simple answer. That's the easiest answer for us. And that's really not how the rabbis conceptualize things. So you'll see I put biological aspects in blue and social cultural aspects in pink. And we don't need to read word for word.
Can we get that through Safari?
Yes.
And so it'd be tractate what?
Mishnah Bikurim, Tractate 4.
Mishnah.
And so you can see that the majority of it is what we would consider to be social cultural. And how do you diagnose or determine something that's social cultural? It's really quite impossible. And so just looking at what they had listed, we would have to guess that biology only played a very small role in it. And we don't know how much that meant that they were analyzing how people behaved and letting that also influence the way that people were identified. And so you're right that there is very much a focus on the biology for the first 8 days of whether circumcision happens or not. But then we have to imagine that they kind of kept things open-ended. Well, let's see how this child behaves. Let's see, what they gravitate toward, and sort of give them the option to be themselves in their fullest way as an adult. And that might make their life more difficult. The androgynous actually had to follow double the rules because they had to follow the rules for men and the rules for women. So it wasn't an easy choice to make. But they did not force the androgynous to pick a side. And in fact, we see a sort of emphasis that it was wrong to make them pick a side. As Rabbi Yossi says, they are being unique unto themselves. You cannot determine if they are a man or a woman. You have to accept them as they are. So there are some people today who would like to say the androgynous only refers to physiology. It's a physical aspect, and that people who are transgender cannot identify with the androgynous because this is purely physiological. But then I look at this text and I see that there's actually very little here that is actually physiological, and the majority of it is social cultural. So I think that it's really hard for us to get into the mindset of what gender was like 2,000 years ago. We have a completely different concept of gender today, and the way that we understand gender today really cannot be pushed back onto the gender of ancient times.
So let's go into the 21st century on gender today. Are most transgender people who are in the 5 and 6 category, are they agnolit or saris? Are they androgynous, or have they made a choice that, like you, have you made a choice to identify gender-wise versus being androgynous?
So I would say that's up to the person and their society. Absolutely. Yeah, how they view themselves and also how society views them. So we'll see in other cultures as well, there's an idea that people who maybe we would call transgender in today's world, they might use different terms in their native languages. They were considered to be more of a third gender category, where even if they take on the roles of women or take on the roles of men, they are considered to be separate multi-gendered beings. And so I would say that that's very similar to this, of even if an androgynous really plays more of a social role of a woman, they're still considered to be a multi-gendered being, and that multi-genderedness is honored. And so it really depends on every single unique situation. And this is actually what they go into with the Jewish law codes, is they say, when we make a determination on what the androgynous should do halachically according to Jewish law, we actually can't have one blanket rule for all androgynous people, because the way in which they're multi-gendered is different person by person by person by person. And so they say there needs to be a rabbi to speak to this person and to give them a unique law that they should follow, each individual. And that makes it so much harder, because everyone else, they have a book to follow. They don't need to go ask a rabbi. They can follow the book. Oh, women do this. Oh, men do this. So that's easy. I know where I fit. But they say actually the androgynous needs a specific individual ruling for every single person. And some people consider that to be difficult. It requires a lot more effort. But the way that I see it is they were really honoring the uniqueness of these individuals, and they were really refusing to put them into any sort of box or category. Even the category of androgynous is really ambiguous. It's more of an umbrella term than even really a gendered category. And they were saying that every single androgynous person is unique, and we need to see them as the unique individual that they are, which, while it's very difficult, there's also so much freedom in that, because the androgynous doesn't feel like they need to be a certain way in order to be respected. Any way in which they are is a way in which is valid and should be recognized.
So I'm aware that could you actually pull up the Mishnah just for one more second? Because I've been thinking, what is like the emblematic text to read on Pride Shabbat, and kind of like how can sum it up on an uplifting note. And I feel like the very purpose of Pride Shabbat is to recognize and honor our common humanity. And when I read Mishnah Bikurim many years ago in rabbinical school, what I most identified with is this capital 4. How is an androgynous similar to both men and women? Guilty are those who strike them and curse them. like men and women. So like just like like if you strike or curse a man and a woman, you're guilty. Just like this way, you're guilty if you strike or curse an androgynous. One who kills them unwittingly is exiled, and if with evil intentions is put to death, like the one who strikes men and women. Their mother brings for them a sacrifice after their birth. They eat the qualified sacrifices like those, like men and women. They inherit all the inheritances like men and women. So effectively, effectively there are all the differences. But what is the main here qualifier and what unites androgynous with the rest of the Jewish community is the fact that they enjoy the same civil rights. And I think, and I think that is, for me, a powerful thing that, like, yes, everybody was somewhat oppressed, in antiquity, because everybody, had to marry at 18 and, and have children and so on. Or in the case of a woman, even at 12 and 3 months, but so everybody was oppressed by gender roles of sorts. But at the same time, these people who didn't fit in them all that neatly were still granted all the rights and all the protections that everyone else.
And just one more statement on that. My favorite part of Mishnah Bikrim 4 is that it has a little bit of a sense of humor. And you'll see this line that's not color-coded that I'm highlighting right now. And if someone says, I will become a Nazirite if this is both a man and a woman, behold, he becomes a Nazirite. And so it's saying that other people will doubt you. They'll say there's no possible way that you're both a man and a woman. And if they dare to make a vow to say, I will change who I am, if this is your real identity, whoops, they've changed who they are because this is your real identity. And so I love that the Mishnah has a little bit of a sense of humor about this.
I mean, and there is also like a legal implication, because if you are a woman, your guardian can cancel your Nazirite vow. But if you say, I am a Nazirite like a man and a woman, so the part that is your female vow can be cancelled, but the part that is your male part cannot be cancelled. So your femaleness might have been cancelled as a Nazirite, but maleness wasn't. So you're a male Nazirite.
Well, that brings us to our end. I just had some last discussion questions. Yeah. I mean, we've talked about this, but just to think of, how might our Judaism or Jewish practice change if we consider the androgynous more intentionally? If we make sure that the androgynous does not become sort of this ignored, obscured sort of footnote as it has in the past, but if we think more intentionally about the androgynous as a part of our tradition and as a part of our current culture.
So I identify very much as a cisgendered gay male. So that was clear to me, but from a very early age, both aspects of both the cisgendered and gay, and the study of androgynous gave me a huge boost because I was able to reconcile them both with an idea that that my gayness is not something that is kind of a sign of femininity, or that I was like, okay, I can have my gender identity and my kind of sexual orientation, and these two are exactly the way they're supposed to be. They kind of reinforce each other and are at the interplay with each other, but I don't have to change one of them to fit the other one.
Well, thank you for this great discussion.
So my question to you is, do most people who are androgynous, but who ultimately go through a process, the physical process,